You watch them move through the world differently. The way they speak about money isn't anxious or desperate. The way they build isn't frantic or lucky. There's a calculated precision to their wealth accumulation that feels almost surgical. And if you're honest with yourself, you've always sensed there's a game being played that nobody explicitly taught you the rules to. The men who accumulate serious wealth aren't just working harder or getting luckier. They're operating from a completely different instruction manual, one written in psychological principles so ruthlessly effective that discussing them openly feels almost transgressive. And the most unsettling part? You've probably been following the opposite principles your entire life, wondering why the gap keeps widening. Here's what nobody tells you about wealth accumulation. You were raised on a mythology of fairness, of meritocracy, of the idea that good work naturally converts to good money. You internalize this so deeply that when you see wealth inequality, your brain scrambles to make sense of it through the only framework you have: luck, privilege, timing, exploitation. And while those factors exist, they're not the full picture. There's something else happening beneath the surface, a set of psychological strategies that powerful men understand intuitively or learn deliberately, strategies that feel uncomfortable to acknowledge because they violate the social contract you were taught to honor. You've been playing checkers with an honor code while others have been playing chess with Machiavellian precision, and the scoreboard doesn't lie about which approach accumulates wealth faster. The first principle operates on a mechanism psychologists call strategic opacity. Powerful men who accumulate wealth understand that transparency about their methods, their margins, and their mechanisms is a liability disguised as virtue. Watch how the wealthiest operators answer questions about their success. They speak in platitudes about hard work and passion, never revealing the actual psychological levers they pull. They know that the moment you understand their competitive advantages, those advantages diminish. This isn't about lying. It's about understanding that information asymmetry is currency. Your coworker who complains loudly about his salary teaches everyone his market value and caps his negotiating power. The man who keeps his compensation private maintains mystique and leverage. You see this pattern everywhere once you notice it. The most successful don't post their wins on social media. They let results speak through observable lifestyle changes that prompt curiosity rather than through explicit declarations that prompt envy and analysis. But here's the truth that stings. You've been programmed to be transparent as a virtue signal, to share your struggles and your strategies as proof of authenticity. And every time you do, you hand away competitive intelligence for free while powerful men guard theirs like nuclear codes. They understand something fundamental about human psychology. People respect what they cannot fully understand, and they underestimate what they can completely see. Your openness about your methods feels like integrity, but functions as strategic disadvantage. Their opacity feels like arrogance, but functions as wealth preservation. Think about Marcus, a software developer who discovered a profitable arbitrage opportunity in his industry. He told 3 trusted friends about it over drinks, excited to share his insight. Within 6 months, 2 of those friends were running the same play, and the market inefficiency he discovered corrected itself through increased competition. Meanwhile, his colleague David found a similar opportunity and told no one. He quietly scaled it for 2 years, accumulated serious capital, then moved into an entirely different venture before anyone understood what he'd been doing. Marcus is still working his developer job. David owns the company. The difference wasn't intelligence or work ethic. It was understanding that wealth accumulation happens in the shadows of strategic silence, not in the spotlight of transparent sharing. The second principle cuts even deeper into psychology. Powerful men understand that wealth is accumulated through asymmetric relationships, and they structure every interaction to ensure they're extracting more value than they provide, at least in the transactional sense. This sounds predatory until you realize it's simply the mathematics of capitalism operating at the individual level. They're not being cruel, they're being calculatingly rational. When they hire someone, they pay them less than the value that person generates. When they invest time in a relationship, they're measuring whether the return justifies the investment. When they collaborate, they structure the terms so that success disproportionately benefits them. You might call this selfish, but they call it strategic resource allocation. And the wealth gap between these worldviews speaks for itself. Your brain recoils at this, because you were taught that relationships should be balanced, that fairness is inherently moral, that taking more than you give is exploitation. But wealthy men understand something crucial. In voluntary exchanges, both parties consent because both perceive benefit. The fact that one party engineered the exchange to benefit disproportionately doesn't make it immoral, it makes it strategic. They're not forcing anyone into these asymmetric relationships. They're simply better at structuring terms. You work for a salary that provides you security and predictability. Your employer captures the upside of your productivity beyond that salary. Both parties agreed. One party structured the agreement to accumulate wealth. The other structured it to minimize risk. Decades later, the wealth gap between you isn't mysterious. It's mathematical. And this is where it becomes dangerous, because once you see this pattern, you realize how many of your relationships are structured asymmetrically against you. The company that offers you equity instead of cash is transferring risk from their balance sheet to yours. The mentor who takes your free labor in exchange for exposure is extracting value without commensurate compensation. The partnership structured as equal split despite unequal contribution is wealth transfer disguised as fairness. Powerful men spot these asymmetries instantly and refuse to participate on the disadvantaged side. You accept them because rejecting them feels ungrateful or greedy or risky. Each acceptance is a small hemorrhage of potential wealth that compounds over decades into the gap you now observe. Quick pause. If you had to describe yourself in one word regarding how powerful men accumulate wealth, what would it be? Write it in the comments, then we'll dive deeper. The third principle operates on what economists call time arbitrage, but powerful men understand it as psychological leverage over their own impulses. They accumulate wealth by making decisions their present self hates, but their future self will thank them for, repeatedly, without the emotional drama that paralyzes most people. They buy assets when everyone is fearful, and selling feels like wisdom. They hold through volatility when cashing out feels like prudence. They invest in long-term capabilities when immediate consumption feels more satisfying. This isn't about having more discipline. It's about having a different relationship with delayed gratification rooted in a fundamental belief system about time and value. You operate from a scarcity mindset about time because your brain is wired for immediate threat response. That money in your account feels safer spent on immediate security than invested in uncertain futures. That opportunity cost of learning a new skill feels too expensive when you could be earning now. That discomfort of holding an undervalued asset feels intolerable when selling would provide immediate relief. Powerful men have either trained themselves out of these impulses or never developed them in the first place, and the wealth accumulation difference is staggering. They treat their current discomfort as the price of admission to future wealth, while you treat your current comfort as the reward for present sacrifice. The fourth principle reveals the darkest psychological truth. Powerful men understand that other people's emotional needs are opportunities for value extraction, and they're willing to remain emotionally unavailable in ways that preserve their resources and attention for wealth-generating activities. They don't get pulled into drama that drains time and energy. They don't provide free emotional labor to people who offer nothing in return. They don't allow guilt or obligation to drive resource allocation. This sounds sociopathic until you realize that your emotional availability to everyone's needs is why you're exhausted and under-resourced while they're focused and wealthy. They've made a calculated trade. Some people will call them cold or distant, but they'll have the capital to actually solve problems when it matters, rather than the empty emotional support that changes nothing. Watch how wealthy men structure their time. They don't answer every call, they don't attend every event, they don't engage every argument. They've implemented what psychologists call ruthless prioritization, which is just a clinical term for being willing to disappoint people whose opinions don't materially impact your objectives. You're still trying to be available to everyone, to maintain every relationship, to prove you're a good person through emotional accessibility. They're conserving their finite attention and emotional energy for the relationships and activities that compound wealth. After 20 years, you're well-liked but struggling. They're respected but wealthy. The market doesn't reward your agreeableness. It rewards their focus. The fifth principle operates on a psychological phenomenon called strategic failure tolerance. Powerful men who accumulate serious wealth understand that avoiding all risk of failure doesn't protect wealth, it prevents wealth. They're willing to fail publicly, repeatedly, in ways that would psychologically devastate you because they've decoupled their self-worth from their outcomes. Each failure is data, not identity damage. Each setback is tuition, not proof of inadequacy. This psychological separation allows them to take calculated risks that terrify you, and occasionally those risks generate asymmetric returns that catapult wealth accumulation beyond what salary optimization could ever achieve. Your relationship with failure is toxic because you were socialized to avoid it at all costs. Your parents praised success and punished failure. Your school system ranked you against peers. Your social circle judges outcomes. So you've built a life optimized to minimize failure visibility, which necessarily means minimizing risk exposure, which necessarily means capping wealth potential. Powerful men either weren't socialized this way or they deliberately deprogrammed it. And they move through the world attempting things that might not work, launching ventures that might collapse, making investments that might evaporate. Most do fail, but the ones that succeed create wealth that dwarfs what safety optimized strategies ever could. They understand the mathematics. Limiting downside to zero also limits upside to linear. Accepting downside risk creates exponential upside possibility. The sixth principle is the most psychologically sophisticated. Wealthy men understand that leverage is the fundamental mechanism of wealth accumulation, and they're willing to accept the psychological burden of debt, obligation, and dependency that using leverage requires. They borrow money to buy assets. They use other people's time to scale operations. They accept investment capital that comes with strings attached. They structure deals where they control outcomes without funding inputs. Every form of leverage creates psychological discomfort that your brain interprets as dangerous, and they've learned to tolerate that discomfort as the price of acceleration. You avoid debt because it feels like bondage. You avoid delegation because it feels like loss of control. You avoid partnerships because they feel like risk. You avoid asking for help because it feels like weakness. Every avoidance keeps you operating at the scale of your personal resources, which means your wealth accumulation is capped by your individual capacity. Powerful men understand that individual capacity is the ceiling for poor men and the floor for wealthy men. They multiply their capacity through leverage in all its forms, and they accept the psychological weight that comes with it. They owe people money and sleep fine. They depend on others' performance and maintain calm. They've structured obligations they must fulfill and don't feel trapped. This psychological tolerance for leverage is what allows them to play at scales you can't even conceptualize. The seventh and final principle is perhaps the most forbidden. Powerful men who accumulate serious wealth understand that the social contract is optional, not mandatory, and they violate it strategically whenever the expected value justifies the social cost. They'll break implicit agreements if explicit consequences are acceptable. They'll ignore conventions if the gains outweigh the reputation damage. They'll operate in moral gray zones that you wouldn't touch because your need for social approval exceeds your desire for wealth. This doesn't mean they're immoral monsters. It means they've made different calculations about which rules are actually binding versus which are simply social pressure. You follow unstated rules that nobody enforces because your psychology can't tolerate being seen as rule breaker. You don't negotiate when the price is marked. You don't ask for special treatment when others don't get it. You don't challenge authority when it seems fixed. You don't bend regulations when the letter seems clear. Every one of these invisible rules is a constraint powerful men ignore when the math works. They'll negotiate the non-negotiable, they'll request the exception, they'll find the loophole, they'll operate at the edge of permissible, and when society pushes back, they either absorb the cost or adjust the approach, but they don't internalize the shame that would stop you from trying in the first place. The major realization here isn't that powerful men are better or smarter or more deserving. It's that they're operating from a completely different psychological operating system, one that prioritizes wealth accumulation over social approval, long-term positioning over short-term comfort, strategic advantage over transparent fairness. They've either been socialized into these principles or they've deliberately adopted them, and the compound effect over decades creates wealth gaps that seem mysterious or unfair until you understand the underlying mechanisms. You've been playing a completely different game with completely different rules, and the reason you're losing isn't moral failure, it's strategic mismatch. So how do you regain control? First, understand that you don't have to adopt all 7 principles to shift your trajectory. Even implementing aspects of a few creates meaningful change. Start with strategic opacity. Stop broadcasting your methods, your margins, your mechanisms. Let your results speak while your strategies stay private. This alone will shift how people perceive and value you. Second, audit your relationships for asymmetry. Where are you providing disproportionate value without commensurate return? Restructure or exit those relationships. Where could you structure new relationships with better terms? Do it consciously rather than accepting default arrangements. Third, develop time arbitrage capability. Practice making one decision per week that your present self hates, but your future self will thank you for. Build the psychological muscle of delayed gratification through repetition until it becomes automatic rather than heroic. Fourth, implement ruthless prioritization. Identify the 3 activities that actually compound wealth in your life. Protect time for those activities by becoming less available for everything else. Accept that some people will be disappointed. Choose wealth over universal approval consciously rather than pretending you can have both. Fifth, recalibrate your relationship with failure. Take one calculated risk this month that might not work. When it doesn't, practice treating it as data rather than identity damage. Repeat until the psychological sting diminishes. Sixth, explore one form of leverage you've been avoiding. Maybe it's debt to buy an asset. Maybe it's hiring someone to scale your time. Maybe it's accepting investment capital. Start small to build tolerance for the psychological discomfort. Seventh, identify one social rule you follow that has no actual enforcement mechanism, only social pressure. Violate it strategically once and observe what actually happens versus what you feared would happen. If this video resonates with you, simply write "forbidden" in the comments. This simple word helps tremendously and shows you understood. None of this is about becoming a different person. It's about understanding the psychological mechanisms that drive wealth accumulation and making conscious choices about which principles align with your actual goals versus which social programming you're following on. Autopilot. Powerful men aren't operating from secret knowledge. They're operating from psychological frameworks that prioritize wealth over other values. You can adopt these frameworks partially or completely, or you can maintain your current approach. But you can't maintain your current approach and expect different results. The wealth gap you observe is the mathematical consequence of different psychological operating systems running over decades. Change the operating system, change the output. If this type of content resonates with you, don't hesitate to subscribe to explore other psychological truths together. The men who accumulate serious wealth aren't playing a different game because they're special. They're winning a different game because they understood the rules you were never taught, and they were willing to pay the psychological prices you've been avoiding.